More than 200 doors still hanging on their hinges, nearly 500 windows, most of them unbroken, still facing the sun. School desks aligned toward a blackboard that has not been erased. Dinner plates left on tables where meals were never finished. Beds positioned under windows, waiting for bodies that never returned. Nothing here looks destroyed. Nothing looks rushed. Nothing looks accidental. Bodie wasn't abandoned because something went wrong. It was abandoned because everything finished working. So here's the question that matters. Was Bodie a failure that died, or a system that worked exactly as intended? Before the story continues, tell me in the comments where you're watching this from and which side you're on. And if you're drawn to stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The story of Bodie does not begin with silence. It begins with money. Real money. Sudden money. The kind that rearranges judgment. In 1876, when a rich vein of gold was confirmed in the hills above Mono Basin, the ore was estimated at nearly $3,000 per ton, an amount so large for the time that it defied ordinary comparison. A single wagon load could equal years of wages. A single claim could reorder an entire life. Word traveled faster than accuracy ever could, and within months, the hills around Bodie filled with men who believed they were standing on the edge of permanence. Not opportunity, permanence. That distinction mattered. Prospectors had seen camps rise and fall before. Bodie felt different. The gold was not scattered dust. It was embedded deep in quartz, locked in rock that required mills, machinery, capital, and time. This was not a place you passed through with a pan and a hope. This was a place you settled, invested in, and defended. Within 3 years, Bodie transformed from an empty slope into a functioning city of nearly 8,000 people. That number is easy to say and difficult to imagine at 8,300 feet, surrounded by snowbound passes and weeks of isolation. But the population surge was real. Streets were graded. Lots were surveyed. Lumber arrived by the ton, hauled over mountains that punished both men and animals. More than 60 saloons opened, some nothing more than plank walls and barrels. Others, elaborate establishments with mirrors, chandeliers, and imported whiskey. Hotels rose quickly, advertising warm beds, hot meals, and prices that climbed with demand. A single night could cost more than a laborer earned in a week, and still the rooms filled. What makes Bodie unsettling is not that it grew fast. It is how confidently it assumed longevity. Homes were not tents. They were framed houses with pitched roofs, glass windows, and iron stoves anchored to floors. Families arrived with furniture, pianos, china, and books. These were not items you carried if you planned to leave in spring. A school was built almost immediately, not because children were already there, but because everyone assumed they would be. Newspapers began printing daily, reporting mining yields, weather, crime, and advertisements for tailors, dentists, and photographers. Banks opened their doors, offering loans against gold that had not yet been pulled from the ground. The town organized itself as if the future were guaranteed. Money reshaped time in Bodie. Days were measured in output, not hours. Nights were lit by kerosene lamps and the glow of windows that stayed bright long after midnight. Mills ran constantly, crushing ore that had to justify the cost of extracting it. Each machine represented an investment that required the town to survive long enough to repay it. This created a collective commitment. Leaving was not simply walking away. It meant abandoning capital, equipment, and belief. The more Bodie grew, the harder it became to imagine it ending. Daily life settled into patterns that felt ordinary, despite the environment. Children attended school while their parents worked claims or ran businesses. Laundry lines stretched between buildings even as wind threatened to tear fabric apart. Bakers rose before dawn. Blacksmiths worked until their arms failed. Doctors treated frostbite and mining injuries with equal frequency. The town accumulated routines, and routines are what convince people that a place is real. A city is not defined by its buildings, but by repetition. Bodie had that. Meals at regular hours, church services on Sundays, newspapers delivered in the morning. The repetition created an illusion of stability so strong that it overpowered the warning signs. Those signs were subtle, and they were easy to ignore because everything else appeared to be working. The gold veins were rich, but they were not infinite. The deeper miners dug, the more expensive extraction became. Equipment wore down. Labor costs rose. Winters slowed output. Transport remained difficult and costly. Every dollar earned was partially consumed just to keep the operation alive. The town depended on a balance that required constant success. There was no margin for long-term decline. Yet nothing about Bodie's growth suggested caution. Buildings multiplied. Businesses expanded. People spoke of staying for decades. Some talked about retiring here. The town's architecture reflected that confidence. Structures were spaced closely, maximizing land use. Streets were laid out with intention. Public buildings were built larger than necessary for the moment, anticipating future growth. Bodie did not behave like a gamble. It behaved like a conclusion. The numbers tell part of the story. Thousands of residents, hundreds of structures, millions of dollars in extracted gold. But the more revealing numbers are quieter. How many meals were cooked under the assumption of tomorrow? How many windows were installed facing a future that never arrived? How many doors were built to be opened daily for decades and instead closed once and never touched again? Each decision, made individually, reinforced the belief that Bodie was not temporary. Together, they constructed a shared certainty that drowned out doubt. That certainty is what lingers in the town today. It is embedded in the way houses are oriented to the sun, in the thickness of walls designed to hold heat, in the care taken with details that only matter if someone will be there to notice them. Bodie was not built to be abandoned. It was built to persist. And that is what makes its current stillness feel unnatural. The town did everything right according to the logic of its time. It followed the rules. It invested, organized, and committed. It built a life around a resource that promised enough. The unsettling truth is not that Bodie failed. It is that, for a moment, it succeeded completely. Bodie is often remembered for chaos, but chaos is not what allowed this town to function. Disorder does not build schools. Disorder does not keep businesses open through winters that bury doors and erase roads. What sustained Bodie was structure, quiet, repetitive, and enforced not by law alone, but by habit. By the time the town reached its peak, it had moved beyond the improvisation of a mining camp and into something far more unsettling. Normalcy. Days began at predictable hours. Work started whether the weather cooperated or not. Children walked to school across frozen ground. Meals were prepared at the same times, in the same kitchens, using supplies purchased from the same stores. The town ran because people believed tomorrow would look like today, and they behaved accordingly. There were classrooms with attendance records, desks worn smooth by years of elbows resting in the same place. Teachers planned lessons knowing they would see the same students again next week, next month, next year. Churches filled on Sundays, not because faith was fashionable, but because routine demanded it. Saloons opened early and closed late, serving miners who measured success in ounces and exhaustion in hours. The presence of so many saloons, more than 60 at one point, is often cited as proof of lawlessness. But their very number suggests something else. They survived because customers returned consistently. They were woven into daily life, not interruptions to it. Violence existed in Bodie, but it did not dominate the way stories suggest. Murders were recorded with startling calm. A killing might appear as a short notice in the newspaper, printed alongside advertisements for boots or legal services. Death was acknowledged, processed, and absorbed into routine. That is perhaps the most disturbing aspect. The town did not spiral. It continued. People adjusted. Shops reopened. Children returned to school. The machinery kept running. Bodie did not collapse under violence because violence was not exceptional. It was background noise in a place where risk was constant and life was already fragile. The climate enforced discipline. Winters here were not symbolic. Snow arrived early and stayed late. Drifts reached heights that blocked doors and windows. Temperatures fell to 30 degrees below zero, cold enough to punish mistakes immediately. In these conditions, cooperation was not optional. Wood had to be cut. Fires had to be maintained. Roofs had to be cleared before weight caused collapse. The town developed an unspoken agreement. Survival required predictability. You showed up. You did your part. You did not test the environment's patience. Inside homes, life unfolded with quiet determination. Kitchens were small but efficient. Stoves burned almost constantly during winter months. Meals were simple, heavy, and designed to sustain labor rather than pleasure. Laundry froze on lines. Water had to be carried, heated, and rationed. These were not hardships people endured temporarily. They were conditions people adapted to, refined, and normalized. The town did not feel heroic to those living in it. It felt practical. The streets reflected this order. Buildings were close enough to reduce exposure to wind. Businesses clustered where foot traffic remained reliable even in poor weather. The layout was not elegant, but it was deliberate. Bodie did not waste energy on aesthetics that did not serve function. What beauty existed came from use. Polished door handles, worn steps, paths carved into the dirt by repetition. The town shaped itself around movement, not appearance. Children growing up here learned these patterns early. They learned where not to walk in winter. They learned which buildings were warm and which were drafty. They learned which adults could be trusted in emergencies. They learned that the town worked only if everyone treated it as permanent. These lessons were not spoken. They were absorbed. The town taught them by existing. There were moments of celebration. Dances were held. Music echoed through halls on nights when work allowed rest. People dressed well when occasion demanded it. Photographs from the period show families standing proudly in front of homes they believed would anchor their lives. These images are unsettling not because they depict hardship, but because they depict confidence. Bodie was not surviving on hope alone. It was sustained by conviction. The presence of law reinforced this stability. A jail stood ready, not as a symbol, but as a tool. Rules were enforced not to civilize the town, but to preserve its function. Disorder threatened productivity. Productivity was survival. This logic governed everything. Even violence, when it occurred, was addressed quickly to prevent disruption. The town tolerated danger, but not unpredictability. What is rarely acknowledged is how much effort it took to maintain this balance. Every day required cooperation with systems that offered no forgiveness. A missed delivery, a broken machine, a harsh winter could strain the entire structure. The town operated close to its limits, yet it continued to behave as if those limits were manageable. That tension between fragility and confidence defines Bodie more than any gunfight ever could. Walking through the town now, this is what lingers. Not echoes of violence, but traces of routine. You see it in the way desks are aligned, in the placement of shelves, in the paths worn into floors. Bodie does not feel like a place that collapsed. It feels like a place that functioned until it didn't have to anymore. The order remained intact, even as the reason for maintaining it began to erode. And that is what makes the town unsettling. Bodie was not undone by chaos. It was sustained by order long enough for the ending to arrive quietly. There was no morning in Bodie when everyone woke up and realized it was over. No siren, no announcement, no single event that forced the town to its knees. What ended Bodie was something far less dramatic and far more final. The numbers stopped agreeing with each other. Gold was still there, but not enough of it. People were still working, but not for the same return. The town did not collapse. It recalculated. And recalculation, once it begins, is difficult to reverse. At first, nothing looked different. The mills kept running. Smoke still rose from chimneys. Saloons opened their doors. Children still walked to school. But beneath the surface, output reports began to shift. The richest veins had already been worked. What remained required deeper shafts, more labor, more equipment, and more time. Each ton of ore demanded greater investment for smaller yield. A process that once justified itself easily now required explanation. Every expense needed defense. Every decision had to prove it was still worth making. Businesses felt the change before families did. A shop that once sold out of supplies now carried excess inventory. Orders were placed more cautiously. Credit tightened. Hotels lowered rates, then raised them again to compensate, driving customers elsewhere. One by one, small operations closed their doors. Not suddenly, quietly. A sign removed. A window boarded. A lock turned for the last time. The street did not empty. It thinned. The school noticed next. Attendance shrank, not because families fled in panic, but because some simply didn't return after winter. Desks remained, but fewer were occupied. Teachers adjusted lesson plans to smaller groups. Classrooms grew quieter. This did not register as disaster. It registered as adjustment. The town was accustomed to adapting. What it did not recognize was that adaptation was no longer restoring balance. It was prolonging decline. Houses were the last to acknowledge the shift. Homes carry weight. They represent commitment. Leaving one behind requires more than calculation. It requires acceptance. People waited. They hoped output would improve. They extended timelines. They borrowed against future returns that never arrived. But eventually, the question changed from, "Will this get better?" to, "How long can we justify staying?" The answer differed for each household, but the result was consistent. When families left Bodie, they did not sell their homes. There was no market. They did not dismantle them. The cost of hauling materials down the mountain exceeded their value. Furniture stayed because it was cheaper to abandon than transport. Stoves remained because removing them required labor better spent elsewhere. Personal items were left because they could be replaced more easily than moved. This is why Bodie still feels inhabited. Not because people vanished suddenly, but because they left rationally. They packed what made sense. They locked doors. They walked away believing the town might still recover. Many assumed they would return. That expectation lingers in every room. As population dropped from thousands to hundreds, entire streets lost purpose. Businesses that depended on foot traffic failed. Churches combined congregations. Saloons consolidated. The town did not fracture. It contracted. Services centralized. Life concentrated into fewer blocks. The rest waited. Waiting is a dangerous state for a place. Buildings age whether they are used or not. Roofs fail. Windows crack. Weather intrudes. In a functioning town, these problems are addressed automatically. In a contracting one, they are deferred. Maintenance becomes a decision rather than a habit. Once maintenance becomes optional, decline accelerates invisibly. Bodie reached a point where each remaining resident was supporting more infrastructure than before. Roads still needed clearing. Buildings still needed upkeep. Services still required staffing. But fewer people were paying into the system. This imbalance did not feel catastrophic. It felt inconvenient. And inconvenience, tolerated long enough, becomes abandonment. The final departures did not occur in groups. They happened individually. A family left after selling what little they could. A business owner closed shop and moved to a town with better prospects. An elderly resident died, and no one replaced them. Each departure reduced the justification for those who remained. Eventually, the math made the decision unavoidable. By the time Bodie was nearly empty, there was still no sense of emergency. The town had not failed publicly. It had simply lost its argument. Without gold flowing at a level that justified the environment, the isolation, and the effort, Bodie became an inefficient choice. And inefficiency, in systems built around extraction, is unforgivable. What remains today is the physical record of that calculation. Homes with intact roofs and empty rooms, businesses frozen mid-purpose, streets laid out for traffic that never returned. The town did not decay because it was neglected. It decayed because it was no longer defended. Standing here now, the silence feels deliberate, as if the town accepted the verdict without protest. Bodie did not rage against its ending. It complied. And that compliance is what makes the place unsettling. The town did everything it was supposed to do, and when it no longer made sense, it stopped asking to exist. Most places like Bodie do not survive long enough to become symbols. They are erased, not remembered. Fire takes them. Developers flatten them. Scavengers strip them down to foundations and forget the names. Bodie escaped that fate not because it was cherished, but because it became inconvenient to destroy. When the last residents left, the town did not vanish. It remained in a strange state of suspension, too intact to ignore, too isolated to reuse, too honest to disguise. After the population dwindled to a handful of people, Bodie did not experience a dramatic end. There was no closing ceremony, no official declaration that the town was finished. It simply continued without purpose. Buildings stood empty through winters that no longer mattered. Snow filled rooms where fires once burned. Wind moved through streets that had no reason to exist anymore. For years, Bodie lingered in this condition, neither alive nor gone. Other mining towns burned. Wood construction and abandoned stoves made fire almost inevitable. One spark could erase decades in hours. Bodie burned too, more than once, but never completely. Fires took sections of the town, leaving gaps where buildings had stood, but the core survived. Not enough to function. Enough to remain. Each fire removed a few structures and made the rest seem more permanent by contrast. Looting was another threat. Empty towns attract hands looking for souvenirs, furniture, fixtures, tools. Anything that could be sold or repurposed was at risk. Bodie lost many items this way. Entire buildings were picked clean over the years, yet even this process stalled. The town was remote. Transport was difficult. The effort required to remove heavy objects outweighed their value. What remained was not protected by sentiment, but by arithmetic. Eventually, Bodie drew a different kind of attention. Not from people who wanted to live there, but from those who wanted to understand it. Historians recognized something rare, a town that had not been rebuilt, romanticized, or sanitized. Bodie was not restored to resemble the past. It was the past, aging at a visible pace. This made it valuable in a way few places are. The decision to preserve Bodie did not revive it. It formalized its emptiness. When the state stepped in, the goal was not resurrection, but stabilization. Roofs were reinforced to prevent collapse. Walls were braced. Windows were left broken if they were already broken. Furniture remained where it had fallen. Even debris was often left in place. The town would be maintained exactly as it was found, neither improved nor cleaned. Time would be allowed to continue working, just more slowly. This choice changed Bodie's role completely. It ceased to be an abandoned town and became a managed absence. Every locked door, every boarded window, every empty room existed because someone decided it should remain that way. The town was no longer decaying naturally. It was being preserved in decline. That distinction matters. Today, Bodie contains hundreds of buildings, each stabilized but unused. Paths are marked not to guide life, but to control observation. Visitors walk through the town without entering most structures. Doors remain closed. Windows reveal interiors that feel too personal to belong to no one. The experience is unsettling not because of what is shown, but because of what is withheld. The town exists as evidence, not as space. The silence here is intentional. There are rules: no electricity, no modern fixtures, no reenactments. Bodie is not a performance. It is a record. The town refuses to be interpreted beyond what it already is. It does not tell you how to feel. It allows you to notice. And what you notice is how complete the place still is, how the layout still makes sense, how the infrastructure still assumes people will return, how unnecessary that assumption has become. The town's preservation exposes the gap between structure and purpose. Everything required for life remains, except the reason to use it. This is why Bodie feels different from ruins. Ruins suggest violence or neglect. Bodie suggests conclusion. The town did not rot away. It was allowed to remain as a finished sentence. Every building stands as it was when usefulness ended, and that moment has been extended indefinitely. Bodie refuses to disappear because it was never erased. It was simply left behind in a way modern places rarely are. It became a visible artifact of a process that usually hides itself. The transformation from living town to empty shell is usually covered, renovated, or paved over. Here, it is exposed. Walking through Bodie now, you are not witnessing decay. You are witnessing maintenance of absence, a place kept intact so that nothing else can be added to it. And that preservation, more than any ghost story, is what makes Bodie unsettling. Bodie is usually described as an ending, but that description is misleading. Endings imply failure, collapse, or mistake. Bodie was none of those. What makes the town disturbing is not that it died, but that it worked exactly as designed, and then revealed what that design was always leading toward. Bodie was not an accident. It was an early, visible version of a system that would be repeated across the country in quieter, more polished ways. A place built entirely around extraction, justified entirely by return, and abandoned the moment the equation stopped producing excess. The reason Bodie feels so complete today is because nothing interrupted that process. No rebranding softened it. No redevelopment disguised it. No new narrative was layered on top. The town was allowed to show its true final form. This is the twist most people miss. Bodie did not fail because it was reckless. It failed because it was efficient. Every decision made here followed the logic of its time. Gold justified the risk. Infrastructure justified the investment. Population justified permanence. And when the gold no longer justified the rest, the system did what it was built to do. It disengaged. No sentiment was required. No loyalty was expected. The town was not betrayed. It was completed. That is why Bodie still stands while thousands of similar places do not. It was not profitable enough to reinvent, and not worthless enough to erase. It fell into a narrow space where abandonment was cheaper than transformation. That space is rare, and that rarity is what makes Bodie visible. It is not a warning preserved on purpose. It is a leftover no one found a use for. Once you see Bodie this way, the town changes. The empty houses stop feeling tragic and start feeling instructional. The 200 doors were never meant to be opened forever. The 500 windows were never meant to look out on eternity. They were built to last just long enough to extract value from a landscape. When that value declined, the structures outlived their justification. What you are walking through is not a ghost town. It is an exposed mechanism. This is the uncomfortable realization Bodie leaves behind. The town looks unusual only because modern places hide their endings better. Today, when a place stops being useful, it is not abandoned. It is repackaged. Old factories become lofts. Mining towns become themed destinations. Rail hubs become retail spaces. The structure survives, but the story is rewritten to maintain momentum. Bodie did not receive that courtesy. Its story ended honestly. And honesty, in systems built on growth, feels eerie. The people who lived here were not naive. They were participants in something much larger than Bodie itself. A national rhythm of boom, build, extract, and move on. Bodie was one of the first places where that rhythm played out completely without interruption. Later places learned how to interrupt the ending. They learned how to delay it, disguise it, or outsource it. Bodie shows what happens when none of those interventions occur. This is why the town feels so quiet. Not because it is empty, but because it is resolved. There is no tension left inside it. No argument about what it should become. No struggle over identity. The town accepted the role it was given and stepped aside when that role expired. Very few places are allowed to do that. Standing here, the unsettling thought is not that Bodie is gone. It is that Bodie is finished, while countless other places are still pretending they are not. The difference is visibility. Bodie shows the ending in daylight. Modern versions conceal it behind financing, branding, and temporary relevance. That is the real reason Bodie matters. It is not preserved because it is rare. It is preserved because it is honest. It shows what happens when usefulness ends and nothing steps in to replace it. The town does not ask to be remembered. It simply remains as proof. And once you recognize Bodie as a prototype rather than a relic, it becomes impossible to unsee the pattern elsewhere. Places that feel alive but are quietly hollowing out. Towns that depend on a single justification. Neighborhoods that exist because numbers still agree, for now. Bodie is unsettling not because it is abandoned, but because it reveals how abandonment actually works. The town stands frozen, not as a warning, but as a mirror.